Good? Okay. Good morning and welcome to our Greening Faith event at Lutheran Church of the Cross. My name is Carl Meyer and I will be the moderator for this event. And our guest speaker is Beth Eden, who's standing to my left here. And we're meeting this morning in Victoria, and I'm going to ask Pastor Lyndon Sayers to come forward just to say a few words to acknowledge the lands that we're on and to welcome the guests. Thank you.
All right, so great to have you, Beth. All right, and welcome everyone to Lutheran Church of the Cross. My name's Pastor Lyndon Sayers, pronouns he, him, one of the co-pastors here together with Lyle McKenzie. For those gathering, there's washrooms at the back, just behind where the sound table is set up, if you need that, and we have refreshments outside. So thank you to the Greening Committee for all your wonderful work. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the unceded territory of Algonquin people, including the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich nations. And we do this especially as we think about the climate crisis and ways in which we partner with our Indigenous neighbors, protecting land and water. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndon. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today. Her name is Beth Eden. She is from Victoria, BC. And she is an avid communicator and mobilizer working with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, previously the Millennium Development Goals, focusing on Goal 13, climate action, for over 10 years in entrepreneurship and strategic planning internationally. She's also one of Canada's under 30 sustainability leaders with Corporate Knights. In 2019, she wrote a climate report for the City of Waterloo, resulting in a climate emergency declaration and action plan. Her previous experience includes mobilizing communities, youth, and institutions to implement the Sustainability Development Goals across Canada through UN networks. Please join me in welcoming Beth.
Is it work now? There we go, I can hear myself. Thank you so much for welcoming me today for the Season of Creation as well, and to speak more about climate change. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about what I'm doing at the moment, which is really exciting and is relevant to this area, and give you an overview on a very important event that is happening in early November internationally called the Conference of Parties. I'm just checking that I'm in the right place, and then I can begin. Okay, awesome. So, I always like to start with my favorite quote and something that has been central to all of my work in sustainable development. And sustainable development was kind of coined as a term in the 70s and 80s, and its focus is on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs and ability for future generations to exist, to thrive, to meet their own needs. So this focus is very, very much on our young people. It's about how is it that we're going to allow our young people to live in this world the same way that we did and have all the opportunities that we want them to have to thrive. So that has really been central to my work, and I'll give you a slight overview. Thank you, Carl, for also providing my bio. So I've been working with the United Nations since the age of 13. I actually went to the United Nations for a prayer council with my church when I was living in England at the time, and I presented on the Millennium Development Goals. And these goals were focused mostly on developing countries and helping with health impacts, and trying to eradicate HIV and AIDS, poverty and hunger issues. And it was a very pivotal time for me. I actually was representing England at the time. And I think this was a moment where I got to meet young people from all over the world and really hear about what was impacting them in their local communities. And I realized that the impact that I could have, and I could share that with the world. So this really was a starting point for me when I was 13. I then went on to found my own organization in the UK, which focused on mental health education for self-esteem and self-confidence issues, mostly related to media. And then it later moved on to climate action when the Sustainable Development Goals were enacted in 2015. And these goals focused not just on developing countries that the Millennium Development Goals focused on, but they focused on getting all of the member states of the United Nations to come together to unite under a common framework. And that common framework was 17 goals, and the one goal that I focus my work on is 13, climate action. And within those, there is hundreds of targets and indicators for how we measure and progress those sustainability issues. And I focused on 13.3. That's the human capacity to act on climate change and adapt and mitigate our climate emissions. And I think this is a really important goal because I think education can really change the world. If you educate yourself and you understand the issue, that's the first pillar to know what to do to act. So that's an overview about why I'm here and why I do what I do. I then later worked for the United Nations in program development for the Major Group for Children and Youth, which is a body that is consulted by international governments before they enact policy, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I built the Sustainable Development Solution Network out of the University of Waterloo when I did my degree there in environment and business. And this obviously is my passion and aligned with my values to make the world a better place. But I also realized I needed to get political, and that's what I'm going to be touching on today. Global governments have a very, very big impact on the world. Their decisions impact everything, and they are one of the leading causes of the climate crisis. So I moved my work into politics, where I now sit as the deputy critic for environment for the Green Party of Canada and help to develop their policy platform. And alongside that, I recently became the interim CEO of QS World Merit, which is a charity focused on getting young people involved with the Sustainable Development Goals, which you see here and in the picture, the first picture there under youth. And we try to get young people to do things in their community to progress these issues and educate others. And we believe that opportunity isn't equal for all around the world. A lot of opportunity is offered in the West, whereas other countries do amazing things and their young people are actually very knowledgeable, but they're often not rewarded for their impact and their progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. So our model is all based on measurement and getting people to be rewarded based on their merit on the world. That is, what are they doing in their local communities to progress the Sustainable Development Goals? So you can look us up, qsworldmerit.org, and that's what I do in my week alongside a bit of documentary film work, entrepreneurship, politics, and the odd talk like today. So it's a busy time, but I recommend, if you'd like to know more about that, ask me some questions at the end. We're also working on a documentary right now with the Mawachat and the Muchalat First Nations in around Nootka Island and Gold River area mostly, with the Neutral North Tribal Council, to try to get people to understand the salmon population decline and the impact of fish farms. And that also links to my policy work. Anyway, back to the subject matter, which is the most important one. So if we look at the science, it's very unfortunate. When I was developing this slide last night, well, earlier this week, but refining it last night, I decided to bring in a few more statistics. And it was really hard for me because as a young person, reading reports about our ecological decline is really, really hard. I've been working on this for 12 years now. since the age of 13. And it's really, really hard to see the data that scientists are telling us, that we have 10 years left to act on climate change. This is enacting policy, this is reducing our carbon emissions, and it really is our collective responsibility. And if we don't act soon and over the next 10 years, we will no longer be able to get our hands around this climate change issue. We're experiencing biodiversity loss, we're experiencing weather changes, which I'll speak more about in my next slide. So the average surface temperature has increased by 1.83 centigrade, and this is from the Industrial Revolution. So most of our climate targets are based around this time, when obviously our industries grew so much and our energy generation also thrived, but unfortunately our climate suffered. And we've now seen many different impacts. So the time to act on it is today. Actually, the time to act on it was 10 years ago, but today would be even better. Okay, so what is our impact on Canada? So when I was actually at the University of Waterloo, I did a few terms with a research network called Partners for Action, which focused on getting communities involved and educated on our climate impacts in Canada. And I was wondering if I could ask you all here, what you think our top threat is in Canada for climate change. There is a long list. You can pick one from the list. What do you think is our leading impact out of forest fires, flooding, storm surges, landslides, and droughts? What is the most threatening one in Canada? Anybody like to say? Fire. It's actually flooding, which actually you might be surprised about. So flooding in terms of sea level rise, but then it's also internal flooding with our watersheds and our glaciers. And also my sister lives up in Yellowknife, the Northwest Territories, and there's lots of impacts there with retreats of icebergs, and also the extent our carrying capacity of lakes and watersheds need to increase. So flooding is actually our biggest impact, but we have seen, and a lot is communicated around forest fires. Again, a really big one, but it really is about our communication and our education. So maybe something to look into. And then these impacts affect our human health, they affect our economy, and we see increases in migration. We've now coined a new term, climate refugees. I'm really sad to hear that this is the case, but climate refugees is something that's talked about in the UN a lot. We're not just experiencing, global unrest in countries around the world, but we're also experiencing climate impacts, and that is providing migration and displacement all over the world. And it's really, really sad to see. I will make sure it gets more positive in a minute. So I added this graph here to kind of give you some perspective on what is Canada's carbon emissions. So Prairie Climate Centre has got some great research. There's actually lots of great research out there, but this is one that visually really showed it for me. So the burning of fossil fuels mostly is our leading cause of carbon emissions here in Canada. So we really have to get our hands around the issue of subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, creating more pipelines, exploring more fossil fuel sources to really, really hone in on this climate issue. Another really big one, which I see lots of Teslas around in Victoria, is vehicles and transportation. So I think this is one that's really exciting and has been mentioned a lot in the media and things. But yeah, how are we gonna? We're exploring and we're extracting fossil fuels, and then we're using them in our industries and our transportation. And how is it that we can transition? So I wanted to give you a slight overview about our climate targets in Canada, and I will be speaking more specifically on this because this is really relevant to the Conference of Parties, which my presentation is mostly centered around. So if you can see here, I don't know if you can maybe see it on the live stream, but we're way up here. We need to be down here in terms of our climate targets. So in 2020, our existing climate targets that we were going to reduce carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. Data has shown from scientists that this is not enough. And so the government of Canada has now increased, since this graph, their target to be 40 to 45%. But this would mean we're still somewhere in the middle here, because by 2050, we want to become net zero, which means we don't want any carbon emissions. So things have to move very, very fast. And the main indicator that we're using as well, and a goal, that we're using, is that we want to hit absolute maximum 1.5 centigrade of temperature increase. This was originally 2%, but we've now realized by scientists that at 1.5%, we are still experiencing such extreme biodiversity loss that this should be our absolute maximum. And so we've adjusted our targets in Canada, and the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their report came out just a few months ago, I believe, and they even stated in the report as well that our targets need to be even more ambitious than what we have. We need at least 60% reduction by 2030 to hit that net zero by 2050. So the data's there. We've just not made ambitious enough targets. So how do we make these targets? Why are they important? Well, the Conference of Parties, so it's otherwise known as COP. You may have heard this a few times. That's what I'm going to be centering kind of my presentation on going forward. The Conference of Parties happens every single year and gathers the 163 signed-on bodies by the United Nations to bring together countries, companies, civil society, organizations to accelerate action on climate change. And these 196 members need to create what is called a nationally determined contribution. The nationally determined contribution here in Canada would be that 40 to 45% I told you about by 2030. And all these other countries have to disclose this information as part of the agreement of COP. And what happens is as these countries come together to gather at this conference to share their nationally determined contribution and their plan to meet that contribution. So it's a main decision-making body and gathering of the United Nations. And this year, it's actually happening in Glasgow. It was delayed last year because of COVID, and there was a big activism movement to say it should be online. We shouldn't be delaying talks on climate change. There's no time for that. But it was delayed, and it's happening this fall. Still great to be having it. And there's actually quite a long process to get there, which I will share with you in a few minutes. So what are these agreements? How do they work? Well, these agreements are actually not legally binding, which is also an issue. This often is the case with the United Nations. I've been working on and off with them to create policy with young people. And it's one thing to create a target and the next thing to actually do it. But that being said, it is a global agreement. The COP is led by the main organizing body under the UN called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's many bodies of the UN, but that is the one we're going to focus on. And this started in 1992, and then there was agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol and the 2015 Paris Agreement, which were documents signed on by governments to help them to create their emission reduction targets. So it's a main organ of the UN around climate change. And as you can see, it's to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Since 1992, we've had a lot more data out there, and now we're showing that things really got to step up. So this conference is actually one of the most important conferences, in my opinion, of our time. This is because we realized that we need to secure a thing called net zero, which I'll explain more in a minute. We also need to keep our warming down to 1.5 degrees instead of 2, because climate scientists have explained that this is the indicator which, with the absolute minimum impact on biodiversity loss, human health, the impacts of wildfires, droughts, etc. So our focuses for this event in Glasgow is to really take stock on what countries are actually doing. What are the commitments that those 196 states will bring forward, plus the EU, and how is it that they're actually going to achieve them? There's also another strong focus on climate finance. So a lot of our impact on the climate is actually based about where our money is. And this is something, if you're going to take this home today, look at your bank, have conversations with a financial advisor, maybe look at your investments, because that is where a lot of our impact on climate change lies, is in our finances, and actually in our pensions. There's a big, big push here for that in Canada right now. And it's also, this conference will touch on carbon markets between countries. So I'm personally very, very interested to know what Canada does. Nothing is fully disclosed yet. The government of Canada just announced a few months ago our new target, which is the 40 to 45%, and then net zero emissions by 2050. But I want to know if that's actually going to happen. So will they draft a new global agreement to reach that net zero economy by 2050 or before? What will happen? Because climate scientists have said we need this now, and absolutely 2050 is the latest deadline. In fact, actually, it's more like 10 years, so we've got a little bit less than that time. So it goes without saying, the world is currently not on track, and we need to amp up our climate agreements. I just want to reiterate that and for you to keep that in mind. So this is crunch time. So what is net zero economy? So this is a new focus, and I think in my prediction and hearing from people in this space, there will be a new climate agreement that comes out of Glasgow's COP26, Conference of Parties, and this will focus around a net zero economy. So I'm sure you know what that maybe means, but in small talk, just to go over, it means that we want to make sure that every carbon emissions that we're putting out in the world, in Canada, is offset by, we could do carbon, I've forgotten the name of it, carbon offsets. There's many different ways of carbon capture is something we're actually investing a lot in Canada. So how is it that there is absolutely zero carbon emissions by 2050? And how is it that our economy can still generate income through maybe transitioning our energy sources? Maybe we're still exploring fossil fuels. My personal opinion is that that doesn't need to happen. And still become net zero by offsetting that carbon. So capturing it from the atmosphere, putting money into these clean technologies, et cetera, et cetera. So a good one to keep in your mind. So how does COP work? It's complex. I'm not going to go into details completely. But to say short, UNFCCC has many different bodies. COP is a conference of UNFCCC, the Climate Convention of the United Nations. But throughout the year, there is a cycle of agreements, events, talks, and this is happening all the time. There are certain multilateral meetings, there's certain bodies that are touching on specific areas of the climate agreement. So this is on adaptation. There's a big push for SIDS, which is a small island states, which are experiencing horrific climate impacts on the daily. So there's conferences and talks and policy development around that. There's talks about technology and clean energy transitions. So it's one body where all of these global governments are coming together to present what they've done over the year. Nothing is necessarily new in COP, other than if there's a new agreement, but everything has been done in the past. All the work has been done. Canada's got their nationally determined contribution, and they're ready to present it. So now is the important thing to watch. Where does the action take place? They're there, they're ready to present, they're gonna agree to certain things, but the next thing is about accountability. And that is where we come in. That's where civil society is so important, and political action. So something that's also a bit exciting that I became more involved with in my work with the Major Group for Children and Youth is the COY conference, which is Conference of Youth. And so this is a pre-conference to COP, which is organized by youth globally to bring together local policy recommendations and young scientists to help influence governments on their policy. And so this is also happening in Glasgow, and you may have seen Greta Thunberg. There's lots of other climate scientists that have also been a part of making this happen. And if you are a young person and you're listening, I recommend going over to COY16's website. There's lots of interactive things you can do there. There's lots of campaigns that they're putting out. And another great place to go to would be the Major Group for Children and Youth, which is an organizing body to get young people involved in the political process of the UN. So they have COY and the climate groups, they have migration groups, they have finance groups, they have everything. But yeah, I'm really, really excited about this as a young person, that young people are being listened to, or at least given this opportunity to present what they've been doing over the year, and I hope it influences global governments when they go home and start to act on their nationally determined contributions. So yes, what is our role in Canada? Well, as I stated, our nationally determined contribution is our main thing that we're presenting at COP. And it's to cut our carbon emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. And right now, scientists have said that we're not on track to meeting this goal. I decided not to mention it here because there's lots of science out there about that. But if you are interested, look into this and keep up to date with what's happening. But yeah, hopefully it's an achievable goal. My personal opinion is that it needs to be even more radical than this, but hopefully we'll get there. So what do you need to know, and why is it important to you? Well, I hope I've pleaded my case a little bit. The general public and education, I believe, is one of the most important things in the climate crisis. I've worked on climate literacy projects in Morocco, Portugal, the UK, Canada, and it's actually quite shocking how little people know about this, and the knowledge of what to do. Today I'm presenting on the politics of it, and I want to stress to you that the government holds a lot of power for how we achieve the nationally determined contribution, and it lies in our industries. The leading cause of climate change worldwide is the fossil fuel industry. So how is it that we can help change that? Can we divest as a church? Can we divest as a community? Can we divest in our workplaces? That's pulling out money from fossil fuel companies. I was part of a lot of those movements in Waterloo when I was studying there, and I ended up going to my city and asked if I could apply to be on their board for the Sustainability Advisory Committee, wrote them a report, and then they decided to unanimously declare a climate emergency. It's doable, it's hard, political processes are frustrating, but we have to, create this momentum and run with it. So you do have the power. You're part of, I'm sure, communities out there. Have those conversations with your boards. Have those conversations with the people in power. And what would you like to do during the event? Well, COP is very exciting. You maybe want to be involved with some of the political processes by taking part with observer organizations. There is a link, actually, so I'll make sure that somehow this is circulated. There's many observer organizations all over the world, and these are organizations that have applied to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change to participate as an organizing body for that country, to help with education, to help lobby for certain issues in their countries. And we have amazing, amazing momentum here in Canada. I've worked with many big climate networks and small climate networks and youth climate networks, and there's an array of so many different things happening and mobilized people. So maybe have a look at the Observer organization, see what they're doing with COP. Maybe there's an event you can go to. There's also a green zone, and I tried to find information on this, and they haven't posted it yet because it's early November. The COP conference, I'm sorry, I forgot to actually include it, is happening the 1st to the 12th of November. So we've got a few more months to go. And I know we have an election, so it's a little bit crazy. But the Green Zone is like a digital online platform where they're going to be sharing lots of different interactive and engagement opportunities and trying to get a general audience around the world to understand what they're doing and to share like the highlights of these agreements. And then there's also, they have a page which is Get Involved online. I didn't pull from this directly just because I think it's a lot of engagement opportunities and volunteer opportunities, but I think the real conversation is about how we act here, today, tomorrow, how you go home and you talk to the people that matter and that can make these decisions. So if you'd like to know more about COP and how to get involved, I recommend their website is incredible, actually. Really, really, really good resources. Okay, so how can we support the success of COP? Well, we've already got a nationally determined contribution, so that's already on the way. The one thing that we can do today would be to mobilize locally for climate change. And I think I've gone over that many times in this presentation, but mobilizing locally does more than you think it does. I enacted a climate emergency in the city, and I had no idea that I could make an impact by just showing the data to the mayor. And then they started to create an action plan, and now they're progressing these issues locally. They're investing in bike paths, they're closing down certain major streets to stop cars, they're investing in EV charging stations, and they're renewing and restoring and retrofitting their existing buildings to help with heat consumption. This is my last slide. So when I went to the UN, I went to the UN in 2019 again, after my first time when I was 13, and I went with quite a skeptical mindset. I was like, what I'm doing on the ground does not matter at all. And I was like, I don't know why I'm going to these, they're just going to be talking the talk, presenting their things. I went for the General Assembly, which is in September. And I think the most impactful thing for me is that I heard the speakers and these global governments talk, and I realized how important it actually was for local bodies to do things, whether that's on climate change or another subject matter, because I work with the SDGs, which is social and economic issues. But it's fascinating because they give case studies from all over the world, and they get local speakers on what they're doing locally to act on the climate crisis and these issues. And that's where the momentum is. That's where the change happens. And there's this saying in the UN called local to global, or global to local. And it's that the locals and the local movement does impact these global agendas. We can't act on the SDGs or sustainable development goal, any other sustainable goal, or climate change by saying and writing an agenda and saying we're going to meet this goal. The next thing is actually taking the action and saying, this is what I'm going to implement in my community. This is what I'm going to do locally. And I realized that impact, and it actually really spurred me on when I came back from the UN, because I realized, wow, we do have an impact. We can make a difference. And, you know, from the bottom, it is seen and it's represented at the top. So civil action is really, really important. And I guess that's a nice place to end off. We're on 32 minutes, so there we go. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Beth. That was a very engaging and detailed presentation.
Good.
We have some time now for questions from the people present. Does anyone have a question? If you do put up your hand, I will hand you the microphone so that you can ask your question and everyone can hear you. And then Beth can do her best to answer your question. Or maybe... Okay. And if you're watching this presentation online, please feel free to put your question in the chat, and we will read it out here. Thank you.
The first question is simple. Are you going to be at COP26?
I'm actually not going to be a COP. I would have had the opportunity if I was still working for the United Nations Network. But the civil engagement piece with the UN, you have to apply as an organizer a year in advance. And so obviously, as I didn't do that, I won't be there. But I certainly will be feeling the ripple effects, at least with the charity that I'm running right now. We are working on a climate literacy piece with universities internationally, and they're presenting a little bit more on our idea with that. So I'll be hearing it through the works, I'm sure.
In one of your earliest slides, it said something about if we didn't do something in 10 years, climate change would be irreversible.
Yes.
Do you think, or do the scientists think that it is reversible? I'm enough of a pessimist to think we're far enough down the road that even with net zero by whenever, that climate has changed. So just in your study and your reading from science and your knowledge, where do you think we would actually be able to get? Reverse it or just mitigate? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a hard question because yeah, I don't like reality, but we're already warming to almost 2 degrees in certain areas, and we've seen impacts that cannot be reversed. I'm working on a project in the Marichat and the Muchalat First Nations on the island, and we've seen pretty horrific decline in salmon stocks. Some of them is from industry, such as logging. Others are from climatic change. And I was out in the middle of the night with a fisherman, and the temperature of the ocean was 17.5 degrees. He told me that it's normally 13 at maximum this time of year, and I don't know if that was for any certain reason and what area we were in, but he has seen radical decline in salmon stocks, and just experiencing that firsthand was really scary for me. So I think that if we rally enough at COP and create maybe a global agreement for this net zero before 2050, we could certainly impact some of the impact, like make a difference with some of the impacts on, I don't know if I can even predict what it would be, but biodiversity loss has declined the most this year of any other year on Earth. We've seen horrific impacts. So I think, in short, summarize it, I don't know if we can meet this. I want to have faith in global governments, but it's really hard to do that. And we will be experiencing impacts. And I know when I have children, they won't have the same salmon stocks, or they won't have the same biodiversity that I experienced in my life. And that's sad. So, yeah, I'm sorry to leave it on a sad note, but it's global governments that have to act on this, and I have to try to have faith, right?
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
The first is, here in Victoria, can you comment on things that are happening on the island in Greater Victoria to address climate change? Are you
Do you mean
aware?
in response to climate change?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to be pessimistic. there is, so I guess we could go back to some of my talks with conservation areas. So there is mobilization on creating conservation areas for certain declining stocks. And so we're actually working on an indigenous-led conservation initiative called Salmon Parks, and Salmon Parks is trying to get recognition from the government to stop logging and fish farms in a certain area. If this is successful, which we hope it will be, this conserves the populations, which hopefully helps them to increase. I don't think I'm as knowledgeable in local politics here as much as I would like to be with the current initiatives. I'm more focused on creating a plan for the future, but maybe keep an eye out on some local organizations. We have to stay positive, so yeah, I'm not completely sure, sorry.
I can give you a little bit of information about that. There are two organizations locally in the Greater Victoria area who are working on climate programs. One is the Victoria Chamber of Commerce, which has as one of its goals to promote sustainability and sustainable businesses. And the other is a collaboration of businesses, local governments, and post-secondary institutions. It's called the South Island Prosperity Partnership. And so if you want more information about that, you can look that up online. And they're also focused on making Victoria and the Vancouver Island a sustainable society. So that's two answers to your question.
Perfect.
I know you had another question, but I'd like to give other people an opportunity to ask questions as well, and if time permits, we'll come back to you.
This week on CBC, there was an interview with an investigator here in Victoria through the University of Victoria, and it's a collaboration amongst many universities along the coast, in Oregon, Washington, and as far west as Calgary. And they're looking at pulling carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, out of the air and putting it into the ground under the ocean. And it forms into rock. It just sounded like some ways craziest idea, but they are working very hard at this, and they said, we still have to do all of the things you have been talking about, but this would help us pull the carbon emissions down enough that it would make such an impact. And they are experimenting with that right now as we speak. And I just thought it was very cool that it was the lead investigator was from the University of Victoria.
Oh, that's so cool. It's so nice to hear about a case study locally and everything. And that's what I was talking about with net zero, right? So it's about, that's like an offset in a way. That's carbon capture is a way of counteracting and pulling out carbon of the atmosphere to counteract the other impacts with maybe fossil fuel exploration or something. That's really cool. I have to look into it. Technology is the best.
Hi, you mentioned that locally we can have impacts on government and global decisions. So for us as a locally based community group, what would you suggest is the best thing for us to focus on in terms of support or action?
Good question. I'm glad you asked it. Something that I would ask you back is, what can you control right now? That's a really good starting point. So if we're talking about buildings, retrofits, and you could do an assessment of your carbon footprint related to your energy and heat efficiency. So retrofitting buildings is actually meant to be pretty significant. It's over 20% of our emissions in Canada is because of poorly retrofitted buildings and heat loss. So that could be something you could start. I would start internally with your church to assess what's your impact on the environment in your daily operations. And then if you do want to get political, maybe there's a way that you could go further outside of your realm of daily operations to sit on a board or create a coalition of churches in the area to act on climate change together. It's just an idea.
So Beth, you mentioned at the beginning some of the impacts that have created climate change or a result of climate change. The fires, flooding is the number one in Canada. You mentioned the small island states who are having significant impacts from climate change. So these are things that are now, they're the current reality. In this work that you're doing and the United Nations is doing, COP is doing, are there conversations about how to help communities that are already having to live through the impact, to cope with, adapt to adjust to the current reality until things change significantly in the future?
Yes, there is. So this is called adaptation. And adaptation is what I was doing with flooding, which is, again, back on the home retrofits. The unfortunate reality is a lot of the SID countries are having to displace themselves. People are displaced. There is an island state in Southeast Asia, I believe, that is the sea level rise is so significant that they're actually having to relocate the whole island on land. So that's pretty unfortunate. So that would be the extreme case. But that being said, there's lots of adaptation work to mostly focus on retrofitting buildings so that people can endure these climate impacts, such as an increase in flooding and maybe tsunamis as well. So I was working with that and the seismic, the increase in seismic activity as well. So I don't know much else about anything else, but I do know about homes, so that's what I would say is happening. And definitely actually look into the adaptation work happening by the UN. It's really fascinating, and there's lots of geologists and geographers around the world that are helping to create new technologies to adapt to this changing climate. So, yes.
Thank you.
Actually, I want to mention one more thing.
Yes?
Have you seen hydroponics here as well? Have you seen that maybe? A few of my friends are working on these technologies. And so my sister lives in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and one of the big impacts because of climate change is food insecurity. And so a way of adapting to food insecurity is increasing the hydroponic industry, which needs very, very limited soil and water to grow. It's mostly like fresh, leaf vegetables. I don't know what the technical word is for that. But it's you can grow them vertically inland, what you call in a kind of a greenhouse setting, and it doesn't need a lot of resources. So that's really something I'm really excited about, is like hydroponic technology as an adaptation tool. That wasn't very well scientifically explained, sorry.
Do you have time to tell us a little bit about the film and using education? One of the things I noticed, and I think that Earth.org might be part of the observers organization at COP, and their key focus is around education, good literacy, and curriculum. So if you could talk a little bit about film and that part about education.
Yeah, I would love to talk about this because this is a new venture for me. When I first wanted to go to university, I always wanted to do media because I was always fascinated by communicating with people, and then I got passionate about the environment, and then it came full circle, and I realized what is the most impactful way that we can get as many people as possible to understand climate change, and that is through media, social media, film, documentary, and getting these big organizations and local to communicate. So I actually created a short film for an international competition to be a global ambassador for an organization at the time about homelessness in Toronto. And I created this short film. I spent 24 hours in the street of Toronto. and I put it on YouTube, and it was really about my personal experience with homelessness. I put it online, and it created great momentum. Actually, I think we were on like 6,000 or 7,000 views. It's not that much, but it's pretty good. And I ended up presenting in 3 countries around the world about this film. And I think when you put something out there, you'd be surprised how well received it is or how much momentum it creates. But more locally, now I moved my work onto documentary film with the same director that was working with me, who was a student at the time. And we're working with CPAWS, which is Canada's Parks and Wilderness Society. And they are focusing a lot of their work on logging and fish stocks. And we partnered with them and the Neutral Nooth Tribal Council, which is focuses on 28 First Nations communities, specifically on the island. And we're creating a film for them because a lot of their work is on these conservation efforts to try to protect fish, but nobody knows about them. So they're doing great local work, but the more people know about this, the more money they can raise, and the more politicians that can recognize it and enact policy. So I really think everything starts with communication. And I would like to extend an invitation to you. On October 24th will be the screening of this documentary film, which is just 10 minutes long, in partnership with CPAWS BC and the Neutral Nooth Tribal Council. And we'll be inviting politicians across the island to come and watch the documentary to understand the impacts logging and fish farms have on salmon populations, and get this salmon park conservation initiative by the Indigenous people recognized by the government, untouched, creating this conservation area to help restore the stocks of salmon. So that's my film. Did I answer your question? I think I might have gone off on a little tangent. But I do think it's really powerful. I do that completely voluntarily, but I just realized the impact of communicating through film and media, and I know it's hard to get your hands on sometimes. It's hard to know how to make an impact online, but I think once you just start talking about it, you'll be surprised.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then we'll conclude. I've been watching the UN process for a while, and I think this time I've heard more about 2 specific issues. One you've mentioned, which is climate finance, and the other is nature-based solutions. And I'm just wondering if those are new ideas that are really, things to watch as coming to the fore this time in Glasgow, or are these ideas that have been around for a long time and are just now being mentioned?
They have been around for a long time. There is actually quite a big push for climate finance at the university that I was studying at as well, University of Waterloo. Climate finance, I believe, is actually at the core of the climate crisis, so it's always been around. And that focuses on many different areas, but one of the main ones that I think is important is divesting from the major banks, and major banks hold a lot of wealth, which then hold a lot of ability to act. So divesting from those funds is really, really important, and investing in clean technologies. Their focus is on that, given that it has such a significance. Wealth inequality and wealth is how the world operates, so I know that they're going to have a focus on that. I also have seen a significant push for nature-based climate solutions. I'm not at all in that field. I'm not an ecologist, but there is a really great organization called Youth for Nature. I actually think they might be connected to COP and one of the organizations that will be at the delegation. And they focus on, as I'm sure you're aware, how nature can help solve the issue of climate change through maybe carbon capture naturally. There's also biomimicry, so how is it that create technology that mimics the environment? I've seen a really interesting one, which is in Morocco, they collect fog droplets, like water droplets, and turn it into energy, which is really cool. So that's like kind of on the nature solutions. So no, they're not new ideas. My personal thought is that an opinion is that climate finance is going to be the main one, in my opinion, as the most important.
Thank you. And thank you for presenting to us. It was very interesting. Thanks to everyone for coming today and for joining us online. If you're interested in learning more about Beth Eden and her work, there will be information posted on the Lutheran Church of the Cross's website about this presentation with links to some of the organizations that she's mentioned. So thank you again for attending and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.